I'd just like to begin by saying thank you very much for having me here to the University Coaching Psychology Alumni Association. Is that the right term?
It's very good. Close enough.
Yeah, it's a privilege. I know you mentioned I was on TV and radio, but never in Australia. So this is a new context for me to be engaging with, the kind of professional environment in coaching in Sydney. I must say, having engaged with Michael over the past year or so, I would say that Australia, it seems to me, is one of the leaders worldwide in coaching, and in particular in coaching psychology, which is really an interface between the profession of psychology and the emerging discipline of coaching. And I prefer to think of coaching as a discipline than a profession, and it'll become more evident later in my talk why I say that. All right, I'm going to jump right in, if it's okay, and take you through a brief tour, if you like, of what I've got to offer in the book. Hopefully you'll be interested enough to actually read it. I'd be very interested in your feedback and your thoughts, because it really is, for me, a work of thought. It's not a commercial work. It's something that has evolved over many years given the various positions I've occupied in my career, and so it's a kind of personal view, but through your feedback it might evolve into its next iteration of thinking. So before I jump into the summary, I need to say a little bit about myself personally, because in many respects this book is an expression of the various systemic positions that I've occupied over a 15-year journey in coaching. Ruth very kindly summarized it. I had been a psychologist in private practice, which evolved into a coach, which evolved into management consulting. Then as the profession, and I use the word profession there, but you'll catch me every now and then, but as it sort of became more formalized, then I was someone who was teaching it, having never really studied it because there wasn't anything to study, then supervising other coaches, then providing large-scale coaching offerings to corporates with many coaches in a single intervention. I was involved with Commensa, which is the coaching association, and the launch of that. I was the first chair of ethics of Commensa, and we developed the ethics code, so I was quite interested in the transfer of ethics from the profession of psychology into the discipline of coaching. I got it there. But then about 7 years ago, I moved into corporate. I was seduced by the sharp tip of the capitalist sword, I like to say. And then what we did there was we were one of the first organizations to create our own panel of external coaches, which were not brokered through a consultancy of some kind, but a direct, carefully selected panel, which we've been using for 7 years and evaluating. And that's been a very interesting process as well. And more recently, I've been involved in trying to coordinate executive coaching services with internal organization development consultants and HR consultants inside the organization into some kind of collaborative offering to our various businesses. And I think that's an evolving and very interesting piece of research that's required for those of you that are interested in research. There's very little written about that collaborative interface. Okay, so what you see is coming from that journey. And in that process, for the purpose of this book, I'm hoping this works. Okay. Which one do you press here, Michael? You press right and left, right?
That would be the guess.
Okay.
So what?
How about that? Okay. Okay, no, it's okay. It's perfectly fine.
Okay.
All right, so what I'd like to do is in a single slide, I'm really going to make these 3 points, and then for the rest of the time we'll explore how these 3 points are really expressed in the book. So what I found is that business coaching, and I'm being very, very specific to business coaching here, and I'm not talking about life coaching. Business coaching is unique and distinct from other forms of coaching that are not associated with organizations. And in that case, we'd say life coaching and counseling. And that distinctiveness has not been adequately accounted for in the learning offerings available in the market, and many coaches are actually doing what I would call life coaching inside organizations in the guise of business coaching and charging business coaching fees for it. But actually what they're really doing, let's be honest, is a bit of psychotherapy or counseling, one-on-one with a highly individualized, non-systemic focus. And there's a questionable link between that service and business outcomes. There certainly are personal outcomes for the individual. And most of the time what we hear in the market worldwide, and I hear this in Europe, South Africa and Australia, is, well, if it's good for the individual, then by definition, if the individual transforms, it must be good for business because transformed and healthy individuals are good for business. And that's the ROI narrative that is effectively in the market today. Personally, I think it's not a healthy narrative. I don't believe that shareholders would be happy to just pay what is today really substantial fees for services which can't be properly linked to business outcomes and are not organizational or systemic in nature. They can't really say that it's embedded in some kind of strategic or business activity, but it's highly personalized. Effectively, that kind of work, I believe, should rather be paid for through a kind of health and well-being budget, so the wellness budgets, or the employee assistance budgets, where a company feels it's their duty to look after the mental health of its people and puts a budget aside for that. But to call that business coaching, that's a problem. So what my book does is it essentially shows three things. And let's put that. And the first thing it says is that in order for it to really be business coaching, coaches need to release a bias toward the individual over the organization and adopt the notion of a duality of client. And we'll see how there is a bias that's crept into coaching because of its origination and the influence of counseling toward the individual over the organization. Think about this. How often do you believe that confidentiality is very, very important for the individual you're coaching, and you have a kind of blanket rule that says, what I discuss with the individual is confidential? That is an import, it's an ethical import from psychotherapy. Is it actually culturally aligned to the way we think about confidentiality in business? No. In business, what is confidentiality? Confidentiality is not present unless it's contracted for a very specific purpose. Otherwise, information in the organization is available to everyone. Yeah? So you see, when we contract for confidentiality in coaching, in business coaching, we sometimes make a mistake of thinking we must use the contract for counseling, but actually we need a business confidentiality contract, which is different, which accounts for a duality of client, which is what is the organizational's needs for access to information, not just the individual's needs. Both needs need to be accounted for in terms of privacy of information and access to information, and who owns that information. In counseling, which comes from the medical model, the individual always owns the information, because that's the medical model. If you go and see a doctor and someone else pays your bill, do they then get access to your medical records? No, that's the medical model. But in business, usually the entity that pays owns the information, isn't that right? So if the organization is paying, how can you tell the organization they have no rights to the nature of what's going on in that intervention? They are also a client and they have rights. But at the same time, so does the individual. So the complexity, and it's really about complexity, is that in business coaching you have to account for both clients' needs, for both clients' rights. And often in coaching, because it's come from counseling, we just default to the individual's rights. So that's just one small example of that point, but I'll take you further along the way in a minute. The second point is that in coaching, business coaching, we need to balance the theoretical focus in individual psychology with organizational cultural theory. Now, a lot of you that have studied at Sydney University, with Michael in particular, are quite privileged, and let me tell you why. And that is because, Michael is actually quite rare, and I think in some regards Sydney University is quite rare because it has such a strong systems thinking focus in its applications. But if you do a scan of, learning opportunities for coaching around the world, and this is this piece of research that also one can do because I've done it in an ad hoc way, you will find an extreme bias for individual psychology applications in coaching programs. And then there'll be one little module on systems thinking if you're lucky. Seriously. And, but you'll go through a whole journey of humanistic gestalt techniques, NLP, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And then little small, well, let's think about the organization for about 8 hours. Okay, and that's a bias, because actually those of us that work in business, and as all of you do, understand that in most cases one needs to think systemically in the business context, and failure to do that usually results in interventions that are occurring in a vacuum, and it can even be counterproductive with unintended consequences. So that's the second piece that the book looks at. And then the third and final piece is that there is a cultural disconnect. Cultural disconnect between the discipline of coaching, or the emerging discipline of coaching, and business culture, marketplace reality. And that's because the focus has come from the influence of psychology, which has a health and well-being ethos, as it must, but this is not always aligned with the fundamental ethos of business, which is not health and well-being, as much as we would like it to be. What is the fundamental ethos of business? You know, profitability and effectiveness, success at an economic level. Now, absolutely, these can be linked in many ways and often are, but I put this to you, it is not always true that a healthy individual makes for a very like a bunch of healthy individuals make for a very successful business outcome. In fact, just for a moment, think about it. Think about like extremely successful businesses. You will find that it's not uncommon for the individuals in those businesses to be psychologically in fairly dysfunctional states. And similarly, how often does one work with an individual who then sort of shifts and transforms themselves psychologically, only to find that they become a little dispassionate about fighting the great capitalist fight? This is why I don't think it's surprising that so many people receive business coaching, and then it actually wasn't business coaching, it was really like life coaching and counseling, and they resign, they leave. And you know that's a statistic that's coming out of the research now. So some companies should be a little averse to bringing coaching in because they're going to lose their talent. Why? Because there's, you know, not necessarily a link between psychological insight and self-awareness and transformation and being dedicated to taking up your role in a particular capitalist context or organizational context. So there's a big cultural piece here which has really not been explored, but I look at it in the book. So that shift is usually more difficult for people who come from the profession of psychology. It's usually easier for those of you that come from corporate or organizational life and move into coaching, and or the sort of MBA route is usually an easier cultural shift there. But even in those circumstances, what I've discovered is that those that come from a business background who then train in coaching, an enculturation process occurs with all this individual psychology, and they find that they can be some almost like healthcare zealots, go back to organizations to make people well and forget that it's about profit. But there's an irony there. Okay, so those are the 3 points I'll cover, and that's really what the book addresses, and it provides a methodology for it. So what I'd like to put up is firstly is the definition of business coaching from the Worldwide Association of Business Coaches, which was one of the first associations for business coaching specifically. It's been in the ICF as the largest, but it's not specific to business coaching. This is their 2007 definition. They've since revised it. I did speak to the president and said I felt that the revision wasn't as good as the original, and sometimes when something isn't broken, you shouldn't try and fix it. But she liked the new one. So you won't find this on their website. This is their 2007 definition. But I just wanted to point something out in this definition because I think it's profound. And David Lane, some of you may know Professor David Lane from the UK, is very involved with this, with the creation of this particular definition. Or the process of engaging in meaningful communication with individuals, in businesses, organizations, institutions, or governments. That's the easy part. But I've highlighted with the goal of, notice the next words, promoting success at all levels of the organization by affecting the actions of those individuals. Now that, I think, is a profound piece of language. And David Lane says that it sort of came to him, because I think it was his language. I just want to credit him with it. And the reason I think it's profound is because it's an essentially systemic statement. And it's got complexity in it, tremendous complexity. Because the question it begs is this one: who is the client? Who is the client? if the definition is this, okay, you've got to promote success at all levels of the organization by affecting the action of the individual that you coach or individuals that you coach. Who is the client? And of course, it's a trick question, isn't it? Because it's evident that both are the client at the same time. So immediately, systems theory comes into play. Immediately, complexity comes into play. And there was a study done by Right Management in 2009. It included some Australian samples, 28,000 employees, 10 industries, 3 continents. Australia was one. This is a quote from that study. Business coaching needs to be regarded not only as an individual event, but also as an organizational process driving systemic change. And it's amazed me that since 2009, that there's surprisingly little take-up on this kind of finding. And repeatedly we find in the coaching industry an individualistic notion of coaching. It's to help the individual in one way or another, and there's 1,000 ways of constructing that definition. But actually in business, if it's business coaching, it's to do business. Otherwise it's not business coaching, which means it's systemic, it's organizational. Okay, so systemic reality then becomes the landscape for it. So in the book, what I do is I talk about this notion of an axis. Why is it called coaching on the axis? And the idea of the axis, the notion of the axis is that where you coach, you are coaching both and or at the same time. You're coaching both and or at the same time. So it's useful to think about coaching, so business coaching, in an axial way. And on the one side you have the person, and on the other side you have the organizational system. And what you're doing is effectively working at the interface or at the axis between the two to improve the relational state of that interface. Let's put it simply. In business, you employ someone, they take up a contract. So I look after human resources for thousands of people. We do contracts all the time. For a moment, stop and think about that contract. What is the nature of that contract? Why would a company pay a coach? And in terms of that contract. Any contract that you look at says the following. It says we offer you a role. Think about that idea of a role. And we will remunerate you to take up that role and deliver value. That's the equation, isn't it? And when a company or an organization asks you to coach, what they're really asking you to do is to create an optimization, if you like, or to facilitate an optimization of the degree to which the individual can take up the role to deliver value in the organization. That's really the way you measure it. Okay? What does the individual want? The individual wants success in that particular equation for which they're rewarded, but they don't just get money. In some cases, what they really focused on is a sense of personal satisfaction or recognition or status, whatever it might be. Those are all forms of reward that return to them if they're successful. And if you think about all the goal setting in business coaching, when you look at it and you look at it through the axis, you'll see that it's effectively a contractual question. The person says, I used to be in a managerial role, now I've been promoted. I'm now more in a leadership role, I need to be more strategic, be more influencing rather than giving instructions and directing, and I'm finding it a bit tricky to make that adjustment. How often have you heard that? Right? Think about it. The organizational demand is positioning the role with different expectations, and the person is needing some assistance to take it up, to take up that role to really deliver that value. If you coach on the axis, what you're working with is both. Who's the client? Both are the client. Both want the same thing. So goal setting becomes axial, not just what the individual wants. If the individual wants something but the organization hasn't been brought into that goal setting process, you've got a misalignment. If the organization wants something and the individual hasn't been brought into that goal setting process, you've got a misalignment and you fail. If you come with a kind of life coaching approach and you don't load in with the organization, you work in a vacuum, you could even be working in a counterproductive way. Okay. So, one last thing. The reason I put the Smurfs is because you'll see that Papa Smurf is in both circles, right? You notice that? Why do you think that I've put Papa Smurf on both sides? If Papa Smurf is the individual, why is he in the organizational circle as well?
You can't separate him.
Exactly. Can't separate it, because at one level, the individual is the individual taking up their role, but they are simultaneously part of the organizational system. And when they speak to you in the coaching dialogue, sometimes the organization is speaking through them, sometimes the individual is speaking through them, and you have to work with that complexity. And ask yourself how often business coaches are doing that today. You know, my sense is, and from those that I've supervised and taught, not many. Okay, so let's move to, here I just wanted to kind of put you a little more, why is this the case? If you have a look at, Passmore wrote this in a publication, but he said, when they do the research, they find that the influence of counseling is so profound in the emergence of the coaching field that when you really analyze coaching methodologies, his words, they are just effective conversions from established psychotherapeutic approaches. Now that's a problem. I mean, it's great in the sense that coaching doesn't have to begin as a discipline off a zero base. It comes off an exceptionally powerful and profound psychological research history. And that psychological research can continue to, inform it and help it. But in essence, what it's missing is that you're working in a business context. And therefore, the underlying assumptions of counseling and psychotherapy can be, by mistake, suddenly imported into a coaching context. I'll give you a simple and easy one. How many times have you coached in a business environment and you say something like, how does that make you feel? And what you get back is a little bit of irritation from someone in business. And how many of you have been that person that feels that irritation? Anyone here can relate to that if you're tuned to it? Now the question, how does that make you feel, is actually a very powerful question and absolutely appropriate to ask in any context, including a business context. What is the irritation that is coming back? Where is it coming from? And I'll put it to you, and you'll see in the book, it's coming from a cultural disconnect where the person something in them is saying, listen, this is not therapy. I'm not a patient. This is business. Right? Yet the question is still a valid question. And right in that language base, you can see that importation happening and a little bit of rub. Do you notice that? And yet you do need to locate the affective state of the individual in a coaching process. But what you need to do is attune to the marketplace context, and then that rub doesn't happen. And you can even ask the same question with the same words, but if you're attuned to a business context, find that there isn't that tension. That just gives you a clue to it. Okay, so essentially, in terms of putting it simply, you've got a context where economics is being sort of rubbed up against this health and well-being underlying value system. And you've got, in the same context, in a business context, a systemic or organizational landscape that sometimes rubs up against what is the diet of one-on-one therapy or counseling. And yet, and I just need to really underscore this, there's profound and important influence and psychological technology that is fed into coaching, which is essentially the value proposition to business. It's the fact that all the cultural assumptions piggyback on these, and we don't adjust to the business context that may cause this. This is even for people who come from the corporate side. All right, so let's just go back to this notion of the axis. So on the one side, what you effectively have is the individual, and on the other side, you have the environment. And when you work from a business coaching point of view, what you're really working on is the coaching relationship. And we can start to see the coaching relationship as the conduit or the axial context where the individual with their personal story and personal makeup and the environment with its systemic story, the business with its strategic objectives, the team with its relational politics and landscape,
come into conversation in the coaching relationship, in the coaching dialogue, and a story unfolds. And through that interface, or that storytelling, what one hopes to do in coaching is produce a third story, a shared story, which serves both the business and the individual needs simultaneously. Does that make sense? Okay. So how do you do that? Well, those of you that have studied from a systemic point of view will take to this right away. But it amazes me how often I put up this slide and people look at it and they've been coaching for a long time and they've never ever thought to ask these questions. Because essentially there's no point in coaching an individual inside an organizational context if you aren't thinking about with that individual the way the system works and what they are holding for the system. Because without understanding that, which client do you totally alienate? The organizational client. And simultaneously kill off the individual's opportunity to become more successful because they're working blind to that systemic context. And there's a whole list of questions here which, there are lots of examples and these questions can be used at any time in the book. But there are a whole lot of questions here which, if the coach isn't asking those questions, they're not tapped in that context. One of my favorite ones is the one around decision making, which is the last one. And you have to use a bit of tone when you ask this question. You have to say, how do decisions really get made around here? Do you know that one? Okay. And if you say really, you get the real story of how decisions are made. Because that provides the context within which that individual can succeed. So you get that below and above the surface of what's happening. And you're also trying to unlock the nature of the role that the person has. And I'm not talking about now the contractual role, now I'm talking about the systemic role. So at one level they can be contracted in to be an investment banker and there's a job description. But there's another role that they might be playing in the team. They may be the rescuer or the challenger that challenges the status quo. And you need to work with the way in which they're taking up those roles and how those are translating into a successful outcome, a successful business outcome or not. Does that make sense? And that's why we will often find that they say, can you come and coach this individual, please? They just don't seem to be working out. And when you speak to the individual, what does the individual tell you? They say the problem's with them. And then when you ask for feedback, they say, no, the problem's with him or her. And then coaching is the intervention. You'd be amazed at how many coaches don't think like most of you would have just thought, which is the problem is systemic. Right? All of you immediately do that. You'd be amazed at how many coaches adopt a remedial mindset, a counseling mindset, and think, I'll help the person change so that they aren't disturbing anymore, or that they are a little bit more like everyone wants them to be. Yeah? And effectively then you get a remedial kind of counseling orientation, but not working with that axial interface.
Marc,
Yeah.
so for those important questions which they are being asked, so the purpose of it is to understand the contextual environment the person is in, operating in, is it? Or will it also try to say that these are the status quo, and if the person is at a senior enough position that he can challenge that?
Okay, so that's an excellent question, because the answer to that question is yes. The axis works in both directions. Because there's a level at which the context is wanting the individual to shift, and there's a level at which the individual wants the context to shift. The level of power the individual may have might give them a sense of rights to do it. So if it's a CEO, well, I'll change the context. But actually the truth is that you don't know which way to play, because there's no way of understanding which will give rise to mutual success. Sometimes a new CEO comes in and wants to change the organization, and what they're blind to is the existing cultural system that actually gave rise to the value in the first place, and they break that, and you get dysfunction. So there's a blindness from that direction. At another time, the exact same situation, the CEO comes in, and actually shifting their cultural system is important.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's a conversation, it's a relationship. Because in either context, you don't know, you being anybody, unless you enter into a relationship and create a relationship across the axis. And that relational exchange gives rise to what needs to happen in the system. How, yeah.
That, if you go back to that question you were asking before, where sometimes people align with the organisation and say we'll change the individual and adopt a remedial mindset. The other way it works sometimes is we'll align with the individual and help protect them against the organisation.
Precisely.
So it works in both directions there.
In
Both are just as bad.
Exactly, and you will have seen this so many times, those of you that supervise. The person comes in, they say, you know, when I'm with this particular client, it's like they're up against the evil empire, and they use me as an agony auntie. Do you use that term, agony auntie? Yeah. Like from magazines? Or the reverse, the organisation calls you in and says, we've got a toxic employee, can you help with coaching? Both of these notions are failing to understand a systemic context, but what they're failing to do is to work relationally, to work with the axis. And the coach needs to say, so this is one side of the axis, what does the other side say? And bring them into dialogue with each other. So the coaching relationship is that space for dialogue. And one of the ways that can happen is through this, feedback. It astounds me how many coaches work in long-term business coaching contracts without working with the feedback of the relational field around that individual. It's astounding. They're effectively working in a vacuum. Now, if you work systemically, that would seem like, how could you work if you don't have any feedback on the individual? What you're working with is just that individual story of the organization that they create for you in the dialogue in the room. Yeah? But there are many other voices. Now, one of the ways in the book that I show to work with feedback is to use a relational map. This is one of a million techniques you could use. But you sit down with this person, this is the coachee, Brian, and what we do is we say, Brian, who do you work with? And Brian starts to map. This is actually a direct copy, names changed, of a client that I worked with there 17th of January, whenever that was, whatever year. Put Brian in the center and say, who do you work with? And then Brian writes all the names down. Bev, Astrid's department, there's the CEO, Petra's department. It's a kind of like an organogram, but it's not, because it's a relational map. It's notional. It's not necessarily perfectly scientifically accurate. And he starts to draw lines to say, well, you know, that relationship's not so good. And this particular client said to me, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to rate the quality of my relationship with each of these players. And that's when he went and he started rating them. And a dialogue unfolded about, well, why do you give this an 8 out of 10, but that a 3 out of 10? Why do you think it's like that? You start to ask reflexive questions. I'm wondering what it's like for Bev. Now that you step back and look at this, and insights emerge. In this particular map, he noticed this, how far the CEO was from him, and he wrote, too far from me, right? And an action emerged about how important that was for him to bring the CEO closer, and it started to link together. Now, as I said, it's not a scientific map. It's just a tool to start to get the person to see that they exist in a field, a relational field, a systemic field. And you're working with the axis. It's not about either or. It's about both and. Does that make sense? Okay, so how much time have I got left, Jeff? A couple of minutes. All right, so on the other end of the axis, you've got the individual. And this coaches are very good with. You find in all the coaching trainings, a great deal of time is about answering these questions. For the learner themselves in the coaching process, but in coaching, one always begins with this. So we're pretty good at this. And this is extremely important. It's as important. It's a 50-50. So one does that. And we often will use a whole range of data sources to give us a line of sight between what is the individual's personal history and culture, their personal reality, and how do we understand them. And often in coaching, one will be loaded with all of these. And they're critically important. My question is, what are these for the environment? What are these for the environment? Culture. If this is the culture of the individual, if you wanted to put it that way, you can only work with this in conversation with the cultural context. So culture and climate surveys, your own feedback or relational field gathering, the history of the company, the market it's in, the way things operate. That is actually the other side of the axis. Unfortunately, a great deal of coaching only looks at this and then becomes intrapsychic and works in that individual state. And what I'm saying is this is only valuable if it's placed in an axial way, like that. Okay, so there's a lot more to say, but I wanted to pause here and go straight into Q&A because it's through the questions that will kind of open up different areas. Any questions or comments so far? And we'll dip in through that way.
So I was interested that you said about getting feedback from the organisation, but the picture you had up there with Brian was still Brian's view of the organisation.
Absolutely.
So
thank you. So what you'll find in the book is there's a section, an entire section on gathering feedback. Because if you only work with the individual's reflexive relational field, which is one way to tap the system, so it's Papa Smurf inside the organization, but you don't have other people's actual feedback, you're missing a piece of the axis. So often coaches will work with 360s, and they will work with, in particular, the 360s provided by the organization in the normal course of organizational HR. Let me ask you a scientific question. Is a 360 of any kind a quantitative or qualitative methodology?
qualitative.
Well, how can it be objective? I'm quite serious. Qualitative methodology is inherently subjective. It's descriptive. It's not quantifiable. Yet, in industry, we use 360s with rating scales, and they blind 360s, and then they have a direct connection to a bonus. But we know it's a qualitative instrument, so therefore scientifically, how is it at all possible that it could be objective? It's not objective. When someone gives feedback, which in coaching is the material of the axis, and you don't know A, who is giving the feedback because it's anonymous, and B, they put it on a rating, scientifically that's corrupted. Because what are you blind to? What happens when someone, those of you that received it or worked with it, what happens when someone gets an anonymous 360 rating? What's the first thing that goes on in their mind? Who? They go, I wonder who this is, right? They want to know who it is, and they start fishing. They walk out of the room and they fish. Do they accept it as objective? No. And then what does a really good HR person say to them? You need to just take this.
Yeah.
Just accept it. It's got to be like this. This is a fact in some way. You know? Yeah, but I need to know who said it. Well, that's being defensive, you see. Not at all. It's a complete craziness. What the human being is doing in that context is trying to locate the relationship from which the feedback emerged so that they can understand its meaning.
The other thing that happens is that 360s get gamed all the time in organisations. They're used for all sorts of other purposes.
Precisely. You don't know what those purposes are. So the first thing to say is you absolutely do need to gather your own feedback if you're doing business coaching. You yourself need to do it. And if you do it anonymously, what you kill off is the opportunity to work with Brian. Let's take Brian. Okay? Imagine if I did then engage with many of these people, contracted very carefully with Brian, but not anonymously. Because then we could say, well, it was interesting that Astrid was offering this feedback to you, which is very, very different to Omar offering you this feedback. Why do you think that is? I would say that. Because Omar's got a 10 out of 10 relationship with Brian, and Astrid's got a 3 out of 10 relationship with Brian. So when you work with feedback, you work axially, You say, this is feedback that tells us as much about the other person as it does about you, because it's really telling us about the nature of your relationship. And it's hugely valuable from that point of view. So from a business coaching point of view, blind 360s or 360 reports kill off the meaning-making opportunity of brokering the relational process. And it's the relational process that is the opportunity for success. And if you can't say who said it, and if you don't contract it openly, well, how do you work with it? You work with it as some kind of objective fact in a vacuum, and then you become the agent as well. Positions you in a very peculiar way as a coach if you're going to gather feedback and not be able to say who it's from. Because now the person you're coaching goes, well, I wonder if she knows, the coach, who really said this. And then the person will fish with you in the coaching process, and you'll get a subversive game playing there, and all of you know how uncomfortable that is. Then you become confused about confidentiality. Whose confidentiality are you keeping? You made one with the coach, but then this person said off the record, let me tell you this. Now you know, and they say, but you can't say, you fall over your feet. What happens to the quality of the coaching engagement?
And trust.
And trust. And without that, you've got nothing. So actually, very useful
The
question.
other thing that's really interesting there is to get Astrid's rating of the relationship with Brian, see how close they are.
Exactly. That's, what I asked Brian, and you don't have to use ratings, but what I asked Brian is, would he give me permission to share the ratings that he gave the people when I go and gathered feedback with him? And he said, only the high ones. Okay. And it's funny because of absolutely, but what do you think a good coach says back to him?
You'll learn more from the low ones?
Well, good coach says, let's think about that for a minute. You're prepared to engage in certain relationships, but not in others. How is that affecting the business? That's the question.
From
The fact.
From a systems perspective too, do you really think Omar and Astrid don't talk?
Yes. What was very interesting, it's a side, but then when I did tell Omar that Brian thought it was 10 out of 10, Omar said what he thought in reverse, that Brian was crazy because he couldn't see that he really had some issues with him.
Just in relation to that, to what degree, if you're telling Astrid and Co that you're seeking feedback and that it will be passed back with the name, to what degree are they likely to pull their punches and not give you honest and open feedback?
Excellent, excellent. So you'll definitely enjoy reading the section of my book. The research shows that anonymous feedback is usually more critical than open feedback, statistically. Right? Proved. Antonini did good research there. Now let me ask you a question. You're going to get feedback which is honest, and we'll just get a question around honest. You're going to get more honest feedback, which effectively means more critical feedback if it's anonymous. But now, let's see where this scenario runs. You don't know who said it. So you have to work with it in a vacuum, right? You will then not work with it in a vacuum because no human being does it. You will locate it in your fantasy of who said it. And about 7 out of 10 times you're right. Right, I'm guessing. You walk out with that feedback out of the room, usually provided to you by somebody, coach or HR person, and you see the individual in the corridor at the desk. Run the scenario. What happens? See, I know that you know that I know that you know that you know I know. That's what plays.
But we can't talk about it.
But we can't talk about it, right? So, what do you do with the feedback? That's, there's nowhere to go with it. That's A, which brings it down. B, which is even worse about it, is the following. When they give you this feedback, which is more critical because they're anonymous, the provider of the feedback does not have to put a systemic relational context onto that feedback. They can just give it to you. Pow! Take no responsibility for it in their own relationship. If they know it's not anonymous and they've got to provide the feedback and it's me giving you the feedback, how will it mediate the construction of that feedback? they will think about the effect of giving you that feedback on their relationship. And they will be a lot more careful about giving it to you in a way that you may well be able to hear it. Right? And let's say they hold back 70% of the smack. The 30% is an invitation to work. So when it's not an anonymous feedback and it's provided, that person knows that at some point it's going to be given to you and they're going to be named. In essence, they're providing an invitation for you to come and dialogue with them. Because you can walk out, it was not anonymous, and you can say, hey Michael, thanks for that feedback, I'm concerned about it, I would like to chat. And Michael knows that he was honest about it to a point, and that he gave his name. What is going to be the quality of that subsequent discussion? From the business's point of view, it could actually lead to some real results. So it's ironic. The reason we make it anonymous is to increase the honesty. But the irony is that the anonymity serves to actually, ironically, kill off the very psychological outcome we're trying to create by giving the feedback in the first place.
And that's because we often locate the feedback in the individual and not in the relationship.
Precisely. And it's because we don't, exactly as Michael said, we don't think of feedback as systemic. We think that when you give feedback, it really is about that person. It's got nothing to do with me that I think that person is rubbish at their job. That's got nothing to do with me. They just are rubbish. We don't think that that's a qualitative, subjective statement based in my experience of them, and that the two of us are involved in that narrative. And that I need to own that narrative in some way or form. Because when organizations start thinking like that, and when coaches start bringing that particular way of being in, the opportunity for a systemic intervention, which you remember was the actual point, the opportunity for promoting success at all levels of the organization is created. Or, as was found in right management, the coaching intervention actually is an organizational process driving systemic change. That's what becomes possible. And for that, you can happily charge substantial fees. Because you really can say you're creating a systemic change. Whereas if you're just doing life coaching, highly focused on the individual from a kind of well-being mindset, you really should just charge for that. And it should be part of the budget of wellness. And that distinction has not properly been made in the discipline of coaching, properly, I would say. And we've been stumbling on it. And by the way, both could add value, but it's a different kind of value. This is business coaching. This is life coaching or counseling or well-being work, which is absolutely cool, good stuff. But let's be clear, this is a far more complex and systemic engagement. This is a less complex and more individualized engagement.
You raised before the issue of confidentiality. So can you expand a bit on that? So there is that challenge that, as you said, you've got a dual relationship. So what sort of feedback loops do you use and how do you set up the contract?
Absolutely. Okay. So most coaches that I've seen in coaching contracts come with like a standard confidentiality clause. It basically goes something along the lines of, look, everything I discuss with the individual is confidential, and at some level, anything I feed back to you from you being the organization, and I'm putting my kind of HR, OD hats on here, anything that you get back from the coaching will either have to come from the individual themselves, or I will have to get sign-off from the individual to share this with you. It's like a standard approach. I usually go, hang on a sec. I'm not asking you to counsel the individual. That's counseling, psychotherapy, doctor. That's an automatic boundary system applicable there. You're arriving at that as an assumption, and you don't even know the purpose of this coaching or the degree to which the boundary system you've just suggested for confidentiality would or wouldn't serve what we're trying to achieve in this coaching intervention. It may be that at the end of understanding the purpose of this coaching intervention, that actually is the boundary system we select, which is, as I said, traditional kind of standard. That may be right, but at the same time it might not be. What if it requires a very different sharing? What if it is essential for the organization to participate in the content of that engagement in order to achieve the outcome we're looking for? How do you know? You know, it's not healthcare. Does that make sense? So you need to then contract, and that's business culture, contract for the appropriate confidentiality for this intervention, for this individual in this organization at this time with this coaching goal. And sit back and contract with the individual, the HR person, their manager, and yourself, and have a dialogue and say, what's going to work for what we're trying to achieve here? And let's make that our contract, and then get them to agree. And a lot of the time it will be in exactly the way that, you know, one is accustomed to, but sometimes it won't be. The fact that we aren't even open to it speaks to how we quickly import that assumption.
And sometimes it'll change across the course of it.
Absolutely. Because I'll put it to you that there are absolutely times when you would serve both the individual and the organization by being able to share your understanding of what's happening between them to the separate parties. But then you don't, because you need to get a sign-off to say something, because you're not sure if you're going to say something right or wrong. Because you contracted to be 100% closed. What if you actually had a contract that looked like this? We need to work with a level of trust with me as a coach. I'm saying verbatim, okay? There's a level at which there will be times, Michael's the coach, Jill's the HR person, Ruth is the manager. There may be times in which I do need to broker some dialogue between you and or share things between you in service to your mutual benefit and understanding. I will, wherever I can, engage with you and share what I've said. It will be transparent and open about it, but we will be more successful if we can trust that we can open up the pipes than if we make this decision that it closed, everyone has to sign off all the time. Can we discuss what your concerns might be about that, about me, and actually have that conversation? What's at risk? And that conversation itself about what's at risk, when you have that right up front in contracting, you're already coaching. Because I can promise you all the issues come straight out in that dialogue live, and you think you're busy contracting, but you're not. You've already moved the intervention forward. So I almost want to say, take a risk and have the conversation, but let me be clear. Never go into coaching without having contracted on confidentiality. That would be ethical madness. Make the contract. What I'm saying is, don't just import counseling notions into confidentiality and miss the opportunity to have a different agreement. But you must have an agreement. And you may need to renegotiate that agreement all the time as the thing evolves. That's business.
I've had that before, where I've agreed initially, and then after one session, I had a conversation with the manager and we agreed it's just not going to be possible. So I had to go back and recontract with the individuals and let them know. And they were all fine. And it worked
Right.
well. But yeah, it was. I felt really uncomfortable though. This is the funny thing as the coach, because you're not.
Well, there's a point at which you need to pay attention to that discomfort, because just as staying, you know, completely closed off can be problematic, sometimes you've got to pay attention to that axis, right?
Yeah.
So that what you don't want to become is the axis.
The agent.
The
I call
agent.
it, in the book I call it, you don't want to ever be the agent. You're not the go-between. Wherever
And sometimes
possible,
organisations want you as a conduit to get information they can't have a conversation with the person.
Yeah.
And actually your job is to actually build that conduit, not be that conduit.
Absolutely. And the best coaches that I've seen use the transference of how the organization is drawing them in to play in the system, unconsciously or consciously, drawing them in. They located themselves as, I feel like I'm being pulled into being an agent, or being pulled into being an agony aunt, or being pulled in to share a message that can't be shared. They locate that, and then they work to bring that back in to those that need to have the conversation, rather than act it out. There's a big section in the book about acting out that transference. And that again is even another level of complexity. That's really, really tricky stuff.
So you do have to have that sophisticated understanding.
I mean, you know, we'd conclude, because I think we have to conclude now, right?
Okay, so I will conclude by saying the kind of coaching that business coaching, I mean, in business coaching, I mean executive coaching, leadership coaching, performance, all that kind of coaching. The kind of coaching that really warrants the substantial fees coaches now charge, if you really want to deliver at that level, the competency required from a systems point of view, from a business understanding point of view, from a psychological depth point of view, from understanding yourself and knowing yourself and how you're drawn in is, and it's a personal opinion, is the most sophisticated and advanced level of competency out of the combination of both business consulting and and the psychology profession combined and doubled. And that's why you're in charge, combined and doubled. Okay, so thank you. That's